The humanitarian crisis in Yemen continues as the U.S. and its allies claim to take down the Houthi rebels. However, just last week, Human Rights Watch made allegations that the Saudi-led coalition that includes Gulf allies such as Kuwait and Qatar and the United Arab Emirates dropped U.S.-supplied bombs to a marketplace, killing 119 people, and witnesses estimate that only 10 of those were the targeted rebels. The Yemeni civilian death tolls have now topped 3,200 as of last count in March. Critics here in the West say that these mounting numbers are a result of an almost free flow of weapons to Saudi Arabia. Sales to the kingdom have topped $33 billion in just the last year. Now, a bipartisan effort led by Republican Senator Rand Paul and Democrat Chris Murphy are introducing legislation to restrict those sales. Joining me now to discuss this is former Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times and author Chris Hedges. Thank you so much for joining us today. So the Saudis are arguably America's best consumer, best customer when it comes to arms deals. If Senators Paul and Murphy are successful, and that's a big if, as we know, what might this do to the base of the DoD budget? And it's already, approved spending that's up 6% for fiscal year 2016.
Right. Well, there's very little likelihood that this will pass. The Saudis have an extensive lobbying effort in Washington. And not only do they have high-powered lobbying firms behind them, but they have the defense contractors themselves who have profited and continue to profit off of weapons sales to Saudi Arabia. You mentioned Yemen, and of course Yemen has become a horror show. But much of the unrest and violence that we've seen in the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq is directly traceable to Saudi and Qatari intervention. So, they have become a deeply destabilizing force throughout the region. And until those weapons supplies are cut off, I don't see at any point, the damage that they're doing being curbed.
And obviously that would be at the U.S. discretion.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think realistically it's highly unlikely the arms sales will be cut off for all the reasons that I said. It's much like Israel. I mean, Israel could not continue to carry out the occupation of Palestinian land unless they receive massive $3 billion a year in military aid, most of that, 70% of it being, used for lethal weapon systems.
And, well, Senator Murphy believes in pulling in the reins of this vendor-customer relationship as a matter of national security in and of itself. He issued a statement saying that this is distracting the U.S. Mideast allies from the more important role of fighting ISIS, and it's certainly not winning the hearts and minds of the Middle Eastern community. Those are his words. And your thoughts?
Well, I think we go back and look now, 13 years of the war in Iraq, 15 years of the war in Afghanistan. What do we have to show for it? Tremendous human suffering, millions of refugees, many of them fleeing to Europe, and huge swaths of territory that are failed states, which is what Yemen is going to become. I mean, Yemen was always, never a kind of unified state anyway. It was largely cut up into tribal enclaves. But look at Libya, look at what Syria's become, look at what large segments of Iraq has become, and we have this deep animus on the part of the kingdom and Saudi Arabia towards these groups that they see as a competitor.
You're referencing the power struggle.
I'm talking about ISIS. So ISIS is a Sunni-led group, and the Saudis have moved large numbers of troops up along the border. I think not because they fear an invasion, which is unlikely, but what they fear is the ideology of ISIS infecting larger and larger groups within the kingdom who are dissatisfied with the power structure. And their response has been increased repression internally. And your reporter mentioned the beheadings, which are a common occurrence, including, of course, the Shiite cleric who was murdered, I believe, about a year ago, executed. So Yeah, I think that for those of us who come out of the region, Saudi Arabia is playing a very, very dark role and a very dangerous game, and unfortunately we are empowering them to do it.
Now, part of the legislation to curb the arms sales to Saudi Arabia includes a checks and balance system to the Saudis that they have to show us that they're taking precautions to reduce the risk of killing so many civilians. But is there any real way for them to demonstrate that?
Well, they're so invested in the war in Yemen, which has turned out to be a debacle, and I don't think they're controllable. I mean, you know, the only way to control them is to begin, and I think that this is a kind of important effort, important call, is to curb the weapons sales, to curb their access to these kinds of weapons, to make the intervention that they've done in Yemen, in Syria, harder and harder to do, because the whole sort of vision of the Saudis is complete eradication of what they see as rival fundamentalist groups, the Saudis coming out of Wahhabism. And it's a kind of battle to the death, which we don't want to get into, because the potential for blowback, which we've already seen, is becoming more and more likely as foreign fighters, in particular, under heavy aerial bombardment, are going back to Europe and carrying out the kinds of attacks we saw in Brussels and Paris and other places. That's the difference with al-Qaeda. I covered al-Qaeda for the New York Times. They didn't have foreign fighters like this. So you've got 4,000 to 5,000 people carrying European passports. They don't have an air force, but they have guys who put on suicide vests and walk into airports. And that is aside, along with the kind of chaos in the region and anarchic violence and failed states, it also is going to have increasing ramifications for these fighters who are very easily able to get back into Europe and create havoc.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought up the Wahhabism. So next time that you're in town, I hope to have you back on to discuss a little bit more about that, how it stems from Saudi Arabia. Thank you so much for that. That was former Middle East Bureau Chief for the New York Times and author Chris Hedges.